Part of our gardening experience this year will probably deal with growing our own transplants, maybe a little bit of container gardening on our decks, even possibly amending the soil out in our transplanting or gardening beds. And probably most of us take that practice for granted too. We start out with something that looks like this and we're not really sure what all those different colors and shapes and sizes of particles are. Well, today I'm going to tell you about what is in a soil mix and some of the newest guidelines to make sure we're growing our plants appropriately. Now, there's a lot of time and effort that goes into these types of mixes. The industry wants to make sure that the materials are readily available, that they're relatively inexpensive, they're light enough for us to carry, free of pest, uniform in their mixes and packaging, and then that they're going to store for us a long time. Also, to assist in making sure these practices are set off right, the standards are set by an industry group called the National Bark and Soil Producers Association, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes research and education in the use of soil and bark mixes just like this. So in essence, what we put our plants in, it's very crucial and detrimental that it's done accurately because that ensures the success of our plants. Well, initially, before the 1940s, most of our mixes were very heavy. They actually had sandy loam soil like this, and of course, depending on where you get your sandy loam soil, it may be a different color, but there's quite a bit of sand in this. It's very, very heavy. You can imagine someone working in a nursery or greenhouse having to move these containers. It would be very burdensome on as far as labor, not to mention the fact that sometimes they don't drain as well. So those were actually soil mixes that contained garden soil in it. Well, today the majority of the mixes are called soilless mixes, which really omit the loam or the sandy loam or the garden soil and use other products that make it a little bit lighter, and we want to talk about those. And probably the most commonly used as far as part of a soilless mix is peat moss. And there's variations when we talk about peat moss. Now, this is a product that you may have seen us use on the show or in your particular gardening centers as well. It's used to line baskets. It's used to decorate dried arrangements. It's also used sometimes indoors to cover up our tops of our soil in our pots so it looks a little bit more attractive, and it's called sphagnum moss. Now, sphagnum moss is not, initially anyway, the same thing as peat moss, and what happens in some particular wet areas in parts of the United States and in Canada and other countries, this will be in wet areas and it actually goes through a decomposition process and it composts just like we would do out in our garden, and the end result is peat moss or the sphagnum peat moss that you may purchase for a soil amendment. So it's decomposed. Again, it has to have very wet conditions and it just takes many, many years for it to go through that process, and the finished product would look something similar to this. Now, we have two different types here. We have Canadian peat moss, Canadian sphagnum peat moss, and this particular one is dehydrated to the point it's compressed. It's very thick, and you can see that it's a little bit coarser to an extent, and the officials in Canada actually tell us that the type of sphagnum moss that it is grown there is different from the one from Michigan. Now, this one had a little bit more moisture, but it is finer. Again, it's a little bit different type of product. But in addition to sphagnum moss, you'll also see peat mosses sold from different other types of vegetation like reed or sedge grasses or vegetation, or Hynum products or vegetation, and again it's just decomposed for this purpose. Now, there's a lot of reasons that peat moss is used. First of all, peat mosses will hold as much as 10 times their weight in water. It's still very light. Sometimes it has an acidic base to it, and it has a very high nutrient holding capacity, which is important when we put fertilizers in there to hold them a little bit longer so they don't leach out. When using peat moss, remember that it's dehydrated and very compact and compressed, so there's some things you need to do ahead of time to ensure the success of it. First of all, if you put the mix in a planting bed or try to amend the soil and you don't break it up and get moisture to it, sometimes it will just remain in a brick form and never absorb any water, and you can get into some trouble with some dry or hot spots. So initially you need to either take the peat moss out, loosen it up in a wheelbarrow, break it apart, and get it soaked down pretty well where it's nice and moist. Or if you've got plenty of time to prepare ahead, you can take the bag, lay it flat, cut an I shape in it, open the flaps up, and then scoop a little bit out, and then try to add water in it. Now you'll notice that it's so dry and compacted that it really takes a while for the water to soak in. So you'll need to add several applications of water, and sometimes it'll take a couple of nights for it to really soak in. It will then expand, and if you don't get to it for a while, you can put the flaps back down, store it outside for several days before you ever need to use it. But again, you need to make sure it's then loosened and fluffered up before you start mixing it in with your soil or planting beds. And sometimes, because it's so dusty, like some of the other products we'll be talking about, it's a good idea too to use a dust mask if you're sensitive to some of these particles. Now, the problem with Canadian or Michigan or European peats is some of the new concerns that are coming out. I've heard it compared to like the depletion of our oil wells. How long will it take before these bogs are actually depleted? Are we using it faster than we should be? Because I think you'll find it interesting just to know how long it takes to make some of this peat. For example, to make a 12-inch depth of peat in these bogs, it takes 300 years to make just 1 foot. And the average size bog is anywhere from 5 to 50 feet deep and as much as 1,000 to 2,500 acres. So again, it's a long process. And some of the states have actually enacted legislation to preserve their peat bogs, especially over in Europe. And what does that mean? Well, of course, higher prices and some alternatives. But the thing that I want you to be aware of, some of the countries, like Canada, has actually come up with some guidelines to restore and reclaim their peat bogs. And they also tell us that far more accumulates because of the sheer numbers of peat bogs in Canada than is ever sold as far as the number of bells. So they're not quite as concerned about it as Europe and some of the states here in the United States. But nonetheless, whatever your belief would be, it is a great part of our peat and soil mixes. But there's also some alternatives now showing up on the market just because of those concerns. And one of them is called coconut husk or coir. It's readily available, it's starting to show up on the market, and it's actually distributed by an Oklahoma company. And it looks like this little block here. It's compressed similar to peat moss, but it's sold as a peat moss alternative. And what you would do is add water just like you would with the peat moss, and this bag here, supposedly after the water has been added to it, will swell up about the size of a 4 cubic bag of peat moss like we showed you a little bit earlier and how to add more water to that. But once it's had the moisture, you can see it's very fine. It does look very similar to peat moss again, but it's just a byproduct of the coconut industry as far as the husk. So that's pretty exciting. There's a little bit of research going on about pH and some of the different types of characteristics it has, but it does look like it's going to be pretty popular here in the near future, as well as some other alternatives that are showing up. Those of us in Oklahoma that are familiar with farm life know of alfalfa hay. Well, they're starting to shred this up and use it as an alternative to peat moss. Even some of the byproducts from the cotton husk are showing up. And I think you'll see there's going to be a lot more alternatives in the near future, a lot of exciting things in the works for soilless type mixes. Well, in addition to the peat moss and some of these alternatives, there's other things in a soilless mix. Usually a peat moss might consist of 50%, 75% of the mix with other ingredients. One of those in many mixes would be bark. And the thing that you need to remember about bark, even this type of bark, which is either hardwood or a softwood or a pine type bark, is a byproduct of those particular industries. But these that are added into mixes are composted for a minimum of 30 days before they're ever added in the mix. Now with the bark, you'll see that they also have various benefits. They're lightweight, they contain some trace elements in them, and they're fairly inexpensive. And there's different grades of barks, in other words, different sizes that you can put in your mix. Sometimes you'll even see sawdust, which is a little bit finer. Again, it's composted when it's used in the particular mixes. Some mixes will still use sand. Again, various grades or size as far as the coarseness. Sand makes it a little bit heavier though, but it does benefit the drainage, those types of things. So there are other alternatives that do the same thing that make it lighter, and one of those that we're familiar with is perlite. Now perlite, it looks like styrofoam in a way, but actually what it is, it's made from heat-treated crushed lava. And the perlite, it's lightweight, it provides good aeration, which also results in good drainage in the mix. The pH is close to neutral, it has a great water holding capacity, and so you'll see that very frequently used in some of the soil mixes. Another one with some of the same characteristics is vermiculite. Vermiculite is actually made from heat-treated mica, or a type of rock or nutrient. So it has good nutrient retention, it's lightweight, good water holding capacity, a little bit finer and dustier. We found that it works well in starting our smaller seeds or top dressing even some of our seeds that we put in the garden for the fall garden because it's a little bit finer, but it holds moisture pretty well too. So when you mix up peat moss and some of the various mixes, what you may end up again with is a mix like this. And if you look in that, you'll see some of the bark mixes, the perlite, a little bit of vermiculite and peat moss, no soil or sand added to it, so it's called a soilless mix. Now you'll also see other types of mixes on the market. Some of them will use compost, which this is some out of our compost beds. You'll even see mixes with labels showing charcoal, and charcoal helps absorb moisture and odors and some of the various products or diseases, those types of things. We've used them in terrariums to absorb some of the moisture and odor, mold, those types of things. But I think one of the things that's growing most rapidly is other types of additions to soil mixes that are called polymers or water grabbers or water holding different types of products that actually hold the water in the soil mixes a little bit more. And when you first purchase it, it looks similar to this. It looks almost like sugar. It's in a granular form. And what you do is you add water to it, and it absorbs water and grows almost hundreds of times its size, which you can see here. It's very moist and almost jello-like. And when that's mixed in with the soil initially in greenhouse industry, you wouldn't have to water the pots quite as much. And what this is, some of them are made from starch, others are made from a cross-linked polyacrylamide. And so you'll have various types of mixes, but they're so popular now that some of the companies are adding slow-release fertilizers in with them. They'll come in different colors. And another company that has also introduced the coconut coir has also introduced some of the polymers in little wafers like this that you would put in a container, add water, it would expand like this, and you just grow your plant right in it. They're also experimenting with some that you could use to start seeds with, and again it's got some of the either coconut or peat moss type mix in with the polymer. So you can tell that there's all kinds of things on the market. You can purchase mixes that already have fertilizer, some of these products in them, or you can make your own. And let me give you some soil mix recipes in case you'd like to do that. The first one is a soil mix, which means it would contain 1 part garden soil, 1 part organic matter, 1 part of a drainage material, and that could be sand, perlite, vermiculite, bark, anything that would help in drainage. And then you add 1 cup of 5-10-5 fertilizer per bushel of mix. A soilless mix that you could put together, now again that would omit the sandy loam soil, would be 2 parts peat, 1 part perlite, a 1/2 part bark, 10 pounds of lime, 2 pounds of potassium nitrate, 3 ounces of fitted trace elements, and that mix is added to a cubic yard of mix. And that one would have some of the nutrients and pH adjusters in there that you might need. Now if you want to mix in fertilizers that are organic, you can make up an organic soilless mix that would be a 1/2 cubic yard of sphagnum peat moss, a 1/2 cubic yard of vermiculite, 5 pounds of dried blood, 10 pounds of steamed bone meal, and 5 pounds of ground limestone, and those would almost give you about a full cubic yard of mix. So now hopefully when you look into a soil mix or a soilless mix, you'll know what some of the products are, and we've given you some recipes to maybe experiment and try your own. So hopefully you'll have great success at your container gardening endeavors this season.